Well, hello, everybody. It's John Arnold here, back for another installment of our Watch This Space podcast. And as usual, I'm joined by my colleague, Chris Fine. Hey, Chris, come on board.
Hey, John. Hi, everybody. Great to be back. Thanks for having me, as always.
Yeah, you're welcome. And of course, we have, I think we've found our groove lately in the past few months of doing our podcasts here. And I think for anyone out there who is listening, but also maybe watching what they did to get this podcast, you'll notice the first thing I want to mention is we have a bit of an updated look to the visual for our podcast. So we're trying to do a little bit of branding here, and we hope you like it. And I think there's more to come. So we are following a track to get this podcast a little more interesting and certainly more appealing to a broader audience. So we are hoping you follow where we're going, and we appreciate those of you who have been listening and staying with us for all this time. So we're getting better as we go, and I think, Chris, we have, I think we have a pretty good formula here.
Yeah, I think, as we say, watch this space, and we're going to be focusing more and more on that specific theme. Or a goal of ours is to try to look a little bit ahead and be thoughtful about what's coming and dive a little bit deeper than most people do when they're just reporting news. Right, Sean?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. You know, we're both very analytical. We're both pretty plugged into what's going on in our spaces. And here's the place where we talk about it.
And we hope that will add value. But we're always, as John always says, we're always open to input and things we could cover, things we could do better, things you like, etc.
Agreed. Okay, so on that note, let's get into what we have been seeing out there over the past few weeks. Our last podcast was kind of our opening view of how 2020 is starting out, new decade, etc. And it's an interesting time, right? Because we when you think back, we did this last podcast. What we were talking about in 2010 as that decade started out, and 2020 right now, there's just so many different forms of technology that we have to be working into our lives, and the changes are happening much faster than they were before. So, now it's more like what we talk about might be out of date in 6 months as opposed to 6 years,
Yeah, it's definitely moving faster.
And as we get older, we move slower. But we move with insight and wisdom, right?
Exactly.
That's how we approach it. So we are going to talk about some things that are future looking. Certainly the recent events that I've been attending have a big eye to the future, but also what's happening in the moment. And I think there's a lot to be learned from companies that have been around a long time and how they're adapting. But also for companies that are on the the cutting edge with the new technologies, what they're bringing to the market, because what they see is coming. And I think there's always been a gap, right, in terms of diffusion of new technologies for them being adopted and actually having transformational impact. I think consumer world, things happen a lot faster, but in the enterprise world, there's always a lag, right?
Yeah, and it's interesting how the evolution has been of the processes that cause the lag, because, once upon a time when you ran all your own computing, there was no cloud, there were very few standard platforms, software was too super expensive, systems weren't capable of what they are capable now. There was a lot of technical hurdles, and there still are, but now it's more about the purchasing cycle, security, compliance, finding staff to deploy against the problem. It's just interesting. And I think that will evolve too. And those are all good reasons to be cautious. But it's just interesting about enterprises. The causes evolve, but it's always a potentially long sales cycle.
Yeah. And there's no sure thing, right? I mean, it used to be if you bought an updated, I keep coming back to the PBX because telephony is still so central to everything we think about and use and spend money on in the communication space. When you buy a new PBX, you kind of know what you're getting. You know what it's going to do. You know how it's going to be used. You know how long it's going to kind of have a life cycle for. A lot of certainty around that. And that maybe masks some of the, more adventurous stuff that's coming down the pipe. But the fact is people tend to stay in their comfort zone when they think about these things, unless they have to make a change, right?
Yeah. And I think also in the case of something like a PBX, or let's say a PC/server that's running a traditional kind of operating system, a lot of these problems were debugged decades ago. Like, it's pretty sure that if you have a problem with any kind of a traditional PBX or telephone system, there's a very well-known solution to that. And the same is true for kind of traditional IT infrastructure. But when and I think, so on the telephony side, I think what's interesting is voice over IP and tools like we're using for this recording, the Zoom, Uber Conference, which is actually Dialpad, Skype, WebEx, all of the tools have been around long enough that it is almost getting to the PX point where, even though there's a lot of moving parts, you could deploy it with some degree of confidence. But, the next technology is much less certain, whatever the next technology is, just like this was, for years and years. You would never, if you were an IT manager, you would hardly ever stake your reputation on deploying a no telephones office, whereas now that's pretty common, so it just has to sink in, and other people have to take the arrows in the back. And once that happens often enough and the problems get debugged, you get into the space where, in theory, you can recoup the cash flow for years and years. That cycle is decreasing, though, and so you have to move faster.
Yeah. And that's kind of a lead into future work, which is one of our, common themes, because there's nothing certain when you start. First of all, you call anything future. Obviously, we don't know what it's going to be, but this whole workplace environment is it's an open book right now in terms of where it can go. And we don't really have the ultimate answers yet, like we do when you buy a PBX. But this is the opportunity we're looking at right now. So there's a lot to think about: justifying decisions, implementing things, monitoring, and of course, measuring some kind of a payback on these changes. Because to some extent, these new technologies have to be deployed just because they're new and everyone's doing them. But there's also got to be a business case. There's also got to be a benefit to the organization and to the workplace, right?
Yeah, and actually, you make a very good point. On the watch this space, I think that as a discipline of developing business cases around things like user experiences and less traditional forms of return on investing in a better workplace, that's really going to jumpstart things. Because if you look at what the barriers are to sales right now in some areas of smart workplace, it's really, you have to convince fairly high up, unless it's a top-down thing where you have a very innovative leader, which sometimes you do, who's willing to stake a certain amount of capital, of personal capital on doing this. The business case needs to be more carefully developed. If for example, a person who's not that super senior person is trying to make the case, but I think that's happening. So, that's another thing that, as it happens, I think really starts to drop some of the barriers.
Yeah. And, obviously the more we learn and the more forums we have to talk about these things, there's a little more certainty that goes into how we make these decisions, because it's very easy to be kind of in a vacuum with this stuff and say, what does my organization need? What do I have to do? But when you look at the broader, trends, what companies are doing, what they're learning, it becomes a little easier to justify making these decisions. So I would say that a fair bit of that was on display at the Future of Work Expo that I recently shared in Florida. So I think I'll share a couple of high level ideas from that to kind of round out that discussion. Because I think future work, as you see a lot too, Chris, is it's a bit like this. It's a bit like the AI term itself. It's a loaded term because you're implying that work is going to change and that it might be better. There's always the promise of the future that it's going to be better. But of course, you could be very cynical and point to other areas where it may not be so great. So I think the unknown is always worth talking about, but it's also good to hear what companies are, how they're thinking about it today and what they're basing it on. Right.
Yeah.
So this event that I was at, was part of the ITExpo, which you and I have both had many years of experience attending. And so the first thing I would say is I'm glad to see them embracing this as a topic to update their content and focus, attract the kind of audience that's thinking about tomorrow's technologies and really thinking beyond just the tech, but actually what it means, right? It's very easy to go to a tech conference and just see what's the latest in, routers and servers and mobile and whatever, IT systems and data storage, all that kind of thing. But what it's going to, the next layer of that is what does that translate into for us in the workplace? So that's why I'm happy to be part of this. And you've seen a lot of what's going on as well. So just to kind of get that conversation going, you've seen a lot is from your perspective, especially looking at the corporate real estate sector and how they're thinking about these spaces. Do you think that they're leading the discussion in terms of the companies who are thinking about the space? Like, is the space going to define the workplace, or do you think the workplace is going to define the spaces?
That's a very good question, John, and I think it's very fluid. I've seen a range. I've seen corporate real estate be the leading edge, and I've seen them be the trailing edge. It depends on who's in charge and what their vision is, and how the future technology is presented to them and by whom. Fundamentally, real estate is, especially, real estate is a very financial business. There's a lot of numbers involved. There's a lot of money involved in the scope of it. And it's also very executional, right? Very transactional, executional, not super visionary necessarily. When you have a real estate vision, it's more often a financial vision. Like, I'm going to go develop in this neighborhood, which has not been so developed. Is the way you think forward. You take certain risks and you agree to do them based on principles. However, I think that real estate is hearing more and more from other parts of the company that they need to be more responsive about this. I think that they are willing to be involved, and they have a long experience with architecture and other of the creative parts of facilities. Depending on how it's presented to them, they can absolutely and should be part of the team, and they're getting more and more interested in it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is good to see, and of course, I suppose all eyes are watching these new models, these disruptive models like WeWork, in terms of what kind of an office space is going to really carry the day, the traditional ones or these more the hoteling kind of concept. We shall see. But I wanted to tie that to what was going on at Future of Work, because I think it's a good indication of where people's thinking is right now about this. And the underlying theme to all of this is that AI is going to be a driver for how the workplace evolves. And I think that's also going to be true for how the workspaces evolve in terms of how offices are designed and where spaces are utilized. Because everything is, we're of course being very knowledge sector focused here in terms of office spaces. I realize, factory environments and retail environments are very different. They're going to go through their own sets of changes. But, inside a typical workplace, one of the big pain points still is just everyday communications, just trying to be more efficient with sharing information, finding people, planning meetings, getting workflows going right. Everyday stuff. This is not like we're trying to reinvent the workplace. We're just trying to make it work better. and it's still really problematic. Despite, as you said, a lot of the technologies we use are pretty mature in terms of their evolution, but we still have all these pain points in the everyday workflow. And you really start to wonder, well, is AI going to be the next thing that's going to make it better? Or is this just an intractable reality that as long as we have to work together in a workspace, there's always going to be these bottlenecks and things falling through the cracks, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, human nature is human nature,
Well, John, you're your usual self, but it looked like you put together and shared a great program there. So what did your speakers and guests have to say about this?
Yeah, well, thanks. It was a good program, in terms of the quality and the variety of speakers. And so a lot of the content they were talking about for two things. One is, yes, these problems of day-to-day communication are still out there. And the other one, of course, is contact center. In other words, that customer experience, mandate now that every company seems to be obsessed with addressing and turning to AI. So looking at ways that AI is now transforming the contact center experience. This is what we heard a lot about in terms of how AI tools can now, track customer journeys, how they can detect sentiment in the way we engage, how they can help the agents, respond faster, but also more intelligently because they can access all kinds of information in real time. And a lot of this speaks to automation, and it's not that different in the workspace as well, where you're talking about automating processes around meetings and sharing information. So that's an attractive theme for sure. We still have to worry about the technologies being up to the task. In other words, the quality of AI in terms of its ability to, handle complex tasks is still a ways out. But the use cases are there to justify keep looking along these lines. So what I liked hearing was how vendors are kind of learning as they go, right? Where the most utility comes from having AI capabilities kind of in the mix, almost like in the DNA of how things are done. So a good example of this was Google gave an update on G Suite. And they showed all these kind of granular examples of how working within that platform has lots of AI built into it and machine learning built into it that you may not think about, but obviously Google has, and they're finding, these subtle ways to insert these applications into these everyday tasks. So, good examples would be around, using your calendar, right? And so once G Suite gets to know your patterns in terms of how you set up meetings, it can see that, there are certain people who you generally do the same meetings with all the time. So it can start making suggestions to you, or it can start automatically checking the calendars of all those people. Like as soon as you just enter a couple of keywords that says, I want to start a meeting, it already kind of knows the things you're going to be looking for because you've been doing this for so long. So I thought that was a pretty good example of where, you can make the process more efficient, and it can like handle the process almost like end to end. And then, as you're doing this, you start to look for another one would be what they call, this is a good one, called anomaly detection. So it will help you. In other words, let's say you have some sensitive files in your workflow that may have to do with maybe a patent application or something like that, or strategic planning. And because you identified it as a sensitive document, the G Suite will be able to track activity around that file. So in other words, if it's being shared or downloaded to people that aren't in your kind of known circle of trust, you would have no way to know that, because it could go from, it's like coronavirus, it goes from one to another to another. Well, the G Suite could track that and make could flag it and say, hey, this file that you marked as sensitive is now just been sent to someone who is outside of your circle of trust for this kind of thing. That could be a way to kind of, give you a little more accountability of your data. And that's something you just normally wouldn't be able to do without AI. So little things like that are just like being more granular about our workflows and understanding what's important and what the pain points can be or risks that can be around workflows. To me, those are good examples that will address issues that you may not have had to think about before. But when you get into, privacy and data security, there's a million things like this that AI can step into and help automate, for the way we do our day-to-day tasks.
That is really fascinating. I mean, I agree with it. That's 100% true. I mean, you think about all of the little things that just take up so much time and the mistakes that you can make. So I was thinking, actually, while you were talking, I was thinking about a G Suite example that's kind of interesting. I don't think it's a perfected thing, but you see it now again and you say, wow, that's kind of interesting. In Google Sheets, I'm a big spreadsheet maven, and you start to gradually see little ways that it's helping you. There are so many errors in spreadsheets. We've all made them. You see them all the time, that you can imagine that just in that one area, the billions of dollars of, risk reduction and productivity increase you could get by just looking for anomalies in spreadsheets. Like put it, sort of the equivalent of a spell checking pass that you need a sort of AI to do. But it wouldn't have to be the most brilliant AI. It could just be something better than pure mechanical if then else kind of logic. And you could save a huge amount with that. And they should put that in Excel. They should, it's just an interesting example. And you could look all through all the tools we use every day in the office. You really could see how people focus purely on being automated out of a job, and that is a big thing. But using that anomaly detection logic could really make things better.
Yeah, for sure. And so when I mentioned before about future of work, we don't know what the future is going to be. It could be good, it could be bad. Just on the other side of things, I just want to touch on one more very compelling talk, and it was from Adobe. And that's a company I wouldn't normally think of in this future of workspace, which itself is important because the leaders, the cool companies to be paying attention to aren't just the little incubator startups, that are doing really, really cool specific things, but also bigger companies, that touch a lot of things that may be a little under the radar for our everyday that we don't think about. And I never thought of Adobe in this conversation at all. But they had some really, really interesting examples and use cases. And I didn't know this, but this is kind of a good takeaway for everyone here. They are part of something called the Content Authenticity Initiative. And it's a partnership between Adobe, the New York Times, and Twitter. So this is a new takeaway for me anyways. And it's all about obviously being responsible with how data is used and disseminated, and keep the practices on the good side. So, one of the best practices that the speaker talked about was this idea of, respect the consumer, but serve the creator. So in other words, make sure that when you're creating content using AI tools, ideally to make the workplace a better environment, you're doing so with good intentions, but also to this respect the consumer idea is that you want to make sure you are as objective as possible. So he talked a lot about when we get into things like facial recognition, the technologies ultimately end up serving the people who provide the data inputs. And those data inputs are driven from the sources that are generally the most available. So you have all this pushback, from, visible minorities, unrepresented population segments that don't necessarily turn up in these broad data sets. And that introduces all kinds of potential for risk because there's a built-in bias that comes from your data set that isn't necessarily respecting the whole broad base of consumers. And the same applies in the workplace. So when you get into things like facial recognition, you have to think about where is that going to be used and who it could help and who it could not help. There's a lot of false positives. Obviously, the potential is there. So very effective technologies, but it's got to be, there's a lot of caveats there to do so. And anyways, he cited some very cool examples, and the privacy stuff goes a long way. And we start talking about China, for example. And on the other side, it's also a bit of a call to action to say, how far do you want to take this? So when we talk about future work being unknown, we at least can be aware that, the bad case scenarios are just as likely as the good ones. So to push back against this, for example, he cited cities like San Francisco have made the decision to not use facial recognition in public places because they feel there's too much risk with bad data and bias that's built into these systems that's going to be bad news for certain segments of the population. So that's an example of taking a stand within, in this case, a municipality, but it could also be within an enterprise that says, you know what, we think this technology has too much risk at the moment to be used. The benefits are there, but right now the risks outweigh the benefits. So there's a bit of a call to action there to say, the technology is what it is, but ultimately the humans, the enterprises have to decide how to deploy it. And I thought that was an important takeaway when you start getting into that future of work mindset. What future do we want to create for ourselves, right?
I agree. And you brought up a very good point, which, if we think about something actionable that we can say, I'll propose the following. I think that whenever an enterprise, or really any organization, a city, whatever, is getting involved with something that involves the collection of potentially sensitive, potentially misusable information, I think they need to be very clear about what the framework is for doing it, right? I mean, I'm not sure it's always a yes-no thing. Anytime an enterprise or an organization starts to use data that may be sensitive, or even collecting a lot of data in general, it ought to be done with some kind of a framework. And I think it's not always a yes-no question. Like, it's easy to say you're never going to use facial recognition, but that's kind of as much of an escape as saying we're going to put it everywhere, because in fact, it is going to end up certain places. If the city doesn't, and then everybody who's got a ring system, it's going to come there, or, the on-site corporate surveillance. So what you really need is a framework to define what's okay, what's not okay, how you use it, how you don't use it. A little bit like GDPR is for broad data in general. And I think if you do that, and maybe what Adobe and that consortium are working on, then you can manage to slot it in properly. But I think there are more and more things in the office that are just going to be that way. They're sort of the technology equivalents of, HR and other policies that had to develop for more organic things over the last X decades as corporations grew, or, say environmental rules, things like that. And you can't just blindly, or I guess one should say one oughtn't, in my view, just blindly run ahead or run away when you can't avoid the confrontation one way or another, so you need to plan it. And I think if you do that, you end up being net safer than either extreme.
Yeah. Well, there's so many potential unintended consequences, right, from these technologies. And, as mentioned earlier, the other angle is you go to an environment like China where, that's just how it's going to be, because their mandate is different than in an open society. So there's no laws about how you can and cannot deploy the technology. It's just out there, and you can choose to make of it as you will. But so, okay, there's so much to consider here. I think with future work as a topic, I think we both agree it's obviously going to be a work in progress, literally, for some time to come. And I'm not sure when the cutoff point is going to happen when we stop talking about the future work. Like, will it actually be here and finished? Or is this going to be an ongoing theme that, there'll always be something new to talk about? I think this is a very good, timely thing for a 2020 topic, right? Because the future to me is this decade that's ahead of us now. But I do hope we're talking about different things 5-10 years from now, because the future, it's got to get here eventually, right?
Yeah, but I think you're right that it's a good topic to talk about right now, because I think we're at an inflection point in many, many ways in work and the world in general. And I think, demographically, as we've talked about, socially, culturally, technologically. And so it's a good time to pay attention to this, don't you think?
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's a good way to wrap things up today, Chris, because we are talking about watching this space, right? So we have been watching this space, and it's a good time to be watching this space, because it's exciting, but it's also it's a little worrisome too, because we don't know how right enterprises are going to get it, and we don't know if the vendors will continue certainly pursuing AI. I mean, right now it's the hottest thing going, but there's always the potential for AI to not live up to expectations. It's been down this road before, right? Of being the next best thing and then going into, hibernation for a few years. It doesn't look like that way for now, but there's no guarantees, right? I don't see us going back to the analog world, but, we have to give the future the benefit of the doubt, so to speak, I'd say.
I think you're right, John. I think that's a good little philosophical point to end this on, don't you think?
Yeah. Okay. All right. I'm there. We don't want to keep our listeners longer than they need to be, and we've all got our days to get onto here.
Well, we could go on and on, but we'll continue to watch this space, and I think we're going to stick with this broad river of a theme. We'll dip into other things occasionally, but this whole evolution of work is a pretty big topic.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, on that note, we will wrap up and thank our listeners again. We're really happy you're with us, and we are happy to be here talking about these things. So I'll pass the handoff. I'll give the handoff to Chris to say goodbye, and we will see you on our next podcast.
Well, thanks, John. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Goodbye, and we will talk to you next month.